It happened in the fall of 2020 when I was staying in a cheap motel just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. I was on a long drive back home from visiting family and decided to stop for the night instead of pushing through the exhaustion. The motel wasn't great: dimly lit hallways, outdated furniture, and a front desk clerk who barely looked up from his phone when I checked in, but all I cared about was getting some sleep. The room was small, smelled like stale air freshener, and had that eerie, slightly damp feeling that old motels always seem to have. The walls were thin, the kind where you could hear muffled conversations and the occasional distant sound of a TV from another room. I locked the door, tossed my bag on the chair, and flopped onto the bed, ready to sleep through the night. I'd just started dozing off when I heard it, a faint scraping noise. At first I thought it was coming from the hallway, but when I sat up and listened, I realized it was inside the room. The sound was subtle but deliberate, a slow, dragging movement coming from the air vent. I turned to look at the vent near the ceiling, just above the small desk. The metal grate was slightly rusted, the kind you'd find in older buildings. The noise had stopped, and I told myself it was just the air system kicking on, nothing to be freaked out about. But as I lay back down, the sound started again. This time it was closer. A chill ran down my spine. The scraping was no longer coming from the ceiling vent, it was lower, near the floor, by the second vent beside the door. It was as if something was moving through the air ducts, slowly crawling closer. I sat up again, my pulse quickening. I stared at the vent, waiting, listening, nothing, just silence. I forced a laugh at myself, shook my head and got up to double-check the door lock, making sure everything was secure. Then I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over me, telling myself I was being paranoid. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard it again. A whisper, not from the hallway, not from outside, from inside the vent. I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. The room felt colder, the air heavier, my eyes locked onto the vent near the door, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. Then the grate moved. I didn't imagine it. The screws on the vent cover twisted. The entire grate shifted forward an inch, like something inside had pushed it from behind. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and bolted for the door, yanking it open so fast I nearly tripped over myself. I didn't stop to turn off the lights, didn't stop to look back. I ran to my car, threw my things inside, and sped out of the parking lot like my life depended on it. I drove for nearly an hour before finally pulling over at a gas station, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were still shaking as I pulled out my phone to look up the motel, hoping to find some kind of explanation. That's when I found it. 2 years before, a guest had gone missing from that same motel. A woman traveling alone, just like me. Security footage showed her entering the room, but never leaving. When staff checked the room, her belongings were still there. Wallet, keys, phone, but she was gone. The only clue left behind, the vent near the door, had been ripped off from the inside. I don't know what was in those vents that night. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in that room. It happened in the winter of 2019 when I was driving through a remote stretch of highway in northern Maine. I had left late in the evening, hoping to reach my friend's cabin before midnight, but heavy fog rolled in faster than I expected. The road twisted through thick, endless trees, the headlights barely cutting through the dense mist. It felt like I was driving through a tunnel of shifting shadows, the outside world completely erased. I checked my phone. No service. Just the blank signal bars, reminding me how alone I really was. The drive had been silent for a while, no other cars in sight, just the low hum of my tires against the pavement. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it, a figure, standing in the fog. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer caught in my headlights, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was a man, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. His clothes looked old, out of place, like something from another era. His head was tilted slightly downward, making it impossible to see his face. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly before coming to a stop just feet away from him. My breath hitched as I gripped the wheel, heart pounding. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, the fog curling around him like it was alive. I didn't want to get out, but I couldn't just sit there either. I honked the horn, no reaction. I flicked my high beams, the bright light cutting through the mist. That's when I saw it. His feet weren't touching the ground. My entire body locked up. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The man was hovering, just slightly, his shoes inches above the asphalt. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but before I could react, his head snapped up. His face was wrong, not disfigured, not wounded, wrong. His skin was too smooth, too pale, and his eyes, they were just dark, empty holes. Not like someone with deep-set eyes, but like a void carved into his face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just a deep, aching silence that filled the car like a pressure change before a storm. Then he moved. Not like a person, not with steps. He glided forward too fast, too smooth, closing the distance between us in an instant. My instincts took over. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed away. But the moment I blinked, he was gone. The road ahead was empty, just swirling fog and the trees looming in the distance. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to see if he was still there, lurking just outside my view. I threw the car into drive and sped forward, my only focus on getting the hell out of there. For miles I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. The thought of seeing him sitting in the back seat made my stomach turn. I just drove, white-knuckled, my eyes locked on the road. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the glow of a gas station up ahead, the first sign of civilization in miles. I pulled in too fast, barely getting the car into park before stumbling out, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The attendant inside looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting when he saw my face. He asked if I was all right. I wasn't. I told him what I'd seen, expecting him to laugh, to brush it off as exhaustion or some weird trick of the fog, but he didn't. His face paled, and he slowly shook his head. He said I wasn't the first person to see the man in the fog. He had worked there for years, and every so often travelers would come in, shaking, terrified, describing the exact same thing. A man standing in the road, a face that wasn't right, the feeling of being watched. Some said they saw him standing outside their car, others said they saw him in their back seat, but all of them agreed on one thing. He only appears when you're alone. I stayed at the gas station for over an hour, too afraid to keep driving. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, I refused to check my mirrors. I refused to let myself look, even when I swore I felt something watching from the trees. I made it to my friend's cabin just after 3 a.m., shaken but safe. I tried to forget what happened, tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But sometimes late at night, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I get that feeling again, that pressure, that silence, that presence. And I know even if I can't see him, he's still there. It happened in the summer of 2022 when I was house-sitting for a friend in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio. It was one of those newer developments, all the houses looking the same, lined up in perfect rows. My friend was going out of town for a week and asked if I could stay at his place, water the plants and take care of his dog. It seemed easy enough. The first night was uneventful. The house was modern, comfortable, and the dog, a golden retriever named Max, was friendly and well-behaved. But by the second night, I started to get an odd feeling, the kind that creeps up on you when you realize something is just slightly off. It started with the windows. I had closed the blinds before bed, making sure everything was shut tight, but when I woke up the next morning, one of them was open, not fully, just a few inches, as if someone had been looking in. I told myself I must have forgotten to shut it completely, but as I walked through the house, I noticed something else. The back door was unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked it before going to bed. I checked every window and door, double-checking the locks, but everything else was secure. I tried to shake it off, convinced I was overthinking things, but Max was acting strange. He kept staring at the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, his ears perked, his body tense. The backyard was fenced in, no way for anyone to get in unless they climbed. But Max just sat there, watching as if something was out there. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked. I even propped a chair against the back door, just in case. I fell asleep with the bedroom door slightly open, letting Max sleep by my bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound, a soft creaking. I held my breath, straining to hear. The noise came again, a slow, deliberate creak coming from downstairs. Max let out a low, guttural growl, his body stiffening beside me. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, but my fingers were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I checked the time. It was 3:12 a.m. The creaking continued, moving through the house. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, like footsteps. Someone walking slowly, deliberately. I wanted to believe it was just the house settling, but then I heard it. A long, dragging breath. Not mine, not Max's, something else. I clamped a hand over my mouth, frozen in place. The air in the room felt heavier, suffocating, pressing down on me. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding against my ribs. Max's growl grew deeper, his eyes locked on the bedroom door. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence, heavy, waiting. I didn't move, didn't even blink, and then just outside my door, something scratched against the wood, not like nails, like fingertips, slow, dragging. Max lunged at the door, barking wildly, his entire body pressed against it. My stomach twisted in terror as I reached for anything I could use as a weapon. But before I could move, the scratching stopped. Max barked again, snapping and growling. Then from inside the room, just behind me, a whisper, not words, just breath, right at my ear. I spun around, swinging blindly, knocking over the lamp in my panic. The room flooded with light, but there was nothing there. The space was empty. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, calling my friend in a full-blown panic. He answered groggily, asking what was wrong. My voice shook as I told him someone was in the house, that I had heard something. The line went dead. My screen showed no service. Then my phone vibrated. A new message. Why did you lock the door? I felt my stomach drop. The message wasn't from my friend. It wasn't from anyone in my contacts. Just an unknown number. Max started whimpering, backing away from the door. I felt a wave of ice-cold air crawl over my skin. My hands were shaking as I checked the time again. 3:33 a.m. I didn't stay to find out what was on the other side of that door. I grabbed Max, threw on my shoes and bolted. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care that I left the lights on, the back door wide open. I just ran. I drove straight to a friend's place, shaking so hard I could barely put my key in the ignition. I didn't go back to that house. I called my friend in the morning, telling him what had happened. He sounded confused. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He had never given my number to anyone. No one else should have known I was staying there, but someone did, and they had been inside the house. Some stories never leave you. A face in the fog, a whisper in the dark, a door that shouldn't have been open. The worst part? You never really know if it's over, or if it's just waiting for the next time you're alone. If these stories seriously freaked you out, share and subscribe for more terrifying true horror stories. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because the scariest things happen when you least expect them. Stay safe, and always check the lock.